Some of the breaking news coming in. Walmart, the world's largest retailer, is issuing a new warning today, warning the company will have to raise prices due to President Trump's tariffs.
They are warning that they are not immune from President Donald Trump's tariffs. Said they plan on raising prices on some items as Trump's global trade war sends the company's costs higher later this month.
Americans can end up paying more than $145 extra for a typical imported product even after tariffs were reduced. Consumers are still paying inflated prices, shelves are still running dry, and the supply chain remains disrupted. While the headlines talk about diplomacy and trade talks, the reality on the ground is this: you are still paying more, a lot more for everyday goods. When the Trump administration announced a 145% tariff on Chinese imports in early 2025, the business world went into immediate shock. Unlike previous trade measures, which often included gradual rollouts and product exemptions, this new tariff policy was broad, fast, and uncompromising. Many companies, particularly in retail, logistics, and manufacturing, were given less than 1 week to react. That sudden change sent ripples through every level of the supply chain. As a result, businesses began to drastically cut or cancel their import orders from China. According to supply chain analytics reported by CNBC, bookings dropped by 30% to 50% almost overnight. Vessel schedules were slashed 20% of ships from Asia to the U.S. West Coast were taken offline, and 18% fewer vessels were routed to the East Coast. By May 2025, shipping capacity from China to the U.S. had declined by nearly half compared to a year earlier. These cuts were not precautionary. They were necessary for survival. Importers couldn't afford to gamble on whether their goods would be sellable with a 145% tariff baked into the final cost. This created a highly unusual dynamic supply chain activity collapse, not because of weak demand, but because of policy-induced paralysis. Then came the sudden reversal. In a surprise move, the U.S. and China agreed to a 90-day tariff pause, temporarily lowering rates to 30% and opening a window for negotiation. The move, intended to cool tensions, instead triggered chaos. Businesses that had previously frozen purchasing activities now rushed to place new orders before the 90-day window expired. The industry referred to this phenomenon as a case of whiplash. In freight terms, this meant an immediate and massive spike in demand hitting a logistics network that had just downsized. Ports, which had seen vessel volume fall weeks earlier, were now flooded with incoming containers. Companies scrambled to find available cargo space, while trucks and drivers, many of whom had been furloughed or laid off just weeks prior, were suddenly in short supply. The U.S. freight market, already operating on thin margins, could not expand fast enough to meet demand, leading to bottleneck shipment delays and skyrocketing transportation costs. This logistical overload compounded the original problem. The higher cost of goods wasn't just about the tariffs themselves anymore. It now included inflated freight rates, warehouse congestion, delayed distribution, and supply shortages. Even basic timelines for moving goods, typically about 3 months from factory in China to shelf in the U.S., became unreliable. All these factors converged to ensure that prices at retail never came back down even after the tariff pause. Critically, this policy whiplash also created strategic paralysis for businesses. Do they continue sourcing from China knowing tariffs could rise again? Do they relocate supply chains to Southeast Asia, which would take months or years and require major capital investment? Or do they wait at the risk of being caught off guard again? For most, the uncertainty was too high, and the fallback plan became clear: pass the cost to the consumer. To understand why prices in the U.S. remain high despite a temporary tariff reduction, we have to unpack the actual mechanics of a 145% import tariff and why its impact lingers long after the policy itself is dialed back. A 145% tariff means that any product imported from China, whether it's a $10 phone case or a $1,000 laptop, is taxed an additional 145% of its declared import value. For example, a $100 item would face an extra $145 in tariff costs, bringing its cost before markup and distribution to $245. This does not even account for the additional layers of pricing added through transportation, warehousing, and retail overhead. These additional costs are ultimately passed on to the consumer. This rate is unprecedented in modern U.S. trade history. During Trump's first-term, tariffs on Chinese goods peaked at 25%, and even then they sparked measurable inflation across several consumer categories, especially electronics, apparel, and home goods. But in 2025, the escalation to 145% stunned industry veterans. According to supply chain analysts interviewed by CNBC, only 1 out of dozens of surveyed logistics professionals anticipated a rate higher than 50%. In other words, no one was prepared. Moreover, the execution of this tariff was fundamentally different. In 2018-2019, tariff hikes were phased in gradually, often over several months, and included clear exemptions for sensitive sectors like medical supplies, electronics components, and critical minerals. Businesses had time to adjust sourcing strategies or negotiate new contracts. In contrast, the 2025 tariffs were enacted with less than a week's notice, applied broadly across nearly all categories of Chinese imports, and offered virtually no exemptions. This suddenness meant companies had to make decisions in real time with incomplete information and no safety net. Many halted shipments altogether, unsure whether they could recoup the cost if tariffs remained in place. Others tried to pass the full cost onto consumers, leading to massive price spikes that hit store shelves within weeks. And here's the most important part: even when tariffs were temporarily lowered to 30%, prices did not fall proportionally. Why? Because the supply chain had already absorbed high-cost inventory under the 145% regime. That inventory, often covering months' worth of stock, was still moving through the system. Retailers were not about to take a loss on products they paid inflated prices for just a few weeks prior. Even at 30%, the tariff level remains high. In fact, it's still higher than what most businesses had planned. For many, were expecting 10% to 20% as a worst-case scenario. A 30% tax on imports is still enough to significantly increase the cost of goods, especially for low-margin industries like clothing, electronics, toys, and consumer goods. For many companies, the safe move is still to maintain higher prices until there's greater clarity on what happens after the 90-day pause ends. All of this creates an uncomfortable reality. Tariffs may be dialed down, but their effects linger in the form of delayed shipments, expensive inventory, cautious spending, and risk-averse pricing. In short, even if the trade war appears to be paused, the costs are still very much active, and American consumers are still footing the bill. Now that we understand how tariffs mechanically raise the cost of goods, let's look at how these effects cascade across the broader economy, especially into the wallets of everyday Americans. The first ripple starts with importers and retailers who are forced to price in not only the tariffs themselves, but also a surge in secondary costs, higher freight rates, warehouse backlogs, increased insurance, and penalties from missed delivery windows. When the tariff hit 145%, many companies faced a basic choice: eat the cost and risk losing margin, or pass it along and risk losing customers. In practice, most chose a mix. They raised prices selectively, delayed promotional sales, cut back on product lines, and quietly reduced package sizes, a practice economists call shrinkflation. But the supply-side problems didn't stop there. With international shipments down and domestic demand still strong, logistics systems in the U.S. became overwhelmed during the tariff pause. Trucking capacity became a critical choke point. According to industry estimates cited in the CNBC report, trucking volumes linked to imports dropped by 25% through June 2025, especially in California, the nation's largest port hub for goods from Asia. However, when orders surged back in anticipation of the 90-day tariff window, trucking firms were unprepared. Many had laid off workers, sold off vehicles, or downsized routes during the earlier slump. This triggered a sudden capacity crunch. Too few drivers, not enough trucks, and sky-high demand. Spot freight rates surged, delivery delays piled up, and congestion at ports and rail ramps worsened. Even if tariffs had vanished entirely, these bottlenecks alone would have pushed prices higher. Consumers felt the impact in more subtle ways as well. Delays in getting imported parts and materials slowed down U.S.-based production. For example, critical chemicals used in beverages, cleaning products, and construction became harder to source. Even temporary stockouts forced many companies to turn to higher-cost alternative suppliers, often in countries less equipped to handle large export volumes. While these smaller countries may avoid the China tariffs, their lack of infrastructure-trained labor or regulatory alignment creates a different kind of cost. Longer lead times, more quality checks, and limited scale. All of this feeds into one inevitable result: persistent price inflation, especially in product categories heavily reliant on global sourcing. According to projections cited by industry experts USOS, households could lose up to $4,000 per year in purchasing power if tariffs remain high and supply disruptions continue. And that's assuming no further escalation. The psychological effect on businesses is just as important. When a retailer or manufacturer doesn't know whether tariffs will stay at 30%, jump back to 145%, or fall to zero, they operate cautiously. They hoard cash, avoid risk, reduce hiring, and keep prices high as a hedge against future shocks. Even with the tariff paused, uncertainty itself becomes inflationary. Ultimately, prices aren't just high because of tariffs, they're high because of what tariffs do to the entire system: unpredictability, delay, shortage, and caution. That system is now built into the economy and built into the price tag every time a consumer goes shopping. At the heart of all this disruption lies a deeper problem: strategic uncertainty. While the headlines talk about tariffs, the real damage comes from the unpredictability of policy and the speed with which it has changed. In previous trade cycles, businesses were given time to prepare. During the 2018 to 2019 US-China trade tensions, tariff escalations were announced well in advance. Companies received detailed guidance, knew which product categories were targeted, and were granted exemptions in many cases. While disruptive, the environment was at least navigable. Importers could shift sourcing strategies, renegotiate contracts, or build up inventory ahead of policy changes. But in 2025, the approach was very different. A 145% tariff was imposed almost overnight, with little warning and no clear targeting. It applied broadly with no exemptions, even for sectors critical to domestic production. That policy shock didn't just increase costs, it broke the planning cycle. Companies could no longer make 6-month or 1-year projections with any confidence. Then came the 90-day pause, another abrupt pivot. On paper, it offered relief. In reality, it created a second shockwave. Businesses that had just adjusted to the new tariff regime suddenly had to decide: do we rush to import goods while the window is open? Do we reinstate canceled orders? Do we wait to see what happens after 90 days? The result was what logistics insiders call whiplash economics. Freight demand snapped from historic lows to unsustainable highs in weeks. Trucking companies, retailers, warehouse operators, all were caught in a reaction cycle rather than a planning cycle. And when companies are forced to react, they do so conservatively. They raise prices, delay investment, lay off staff, and avoid commitments that require long-term visibility. Perhaps the most damaging effect of this environment is the paralysis it creates for innovation and transformation. Many firms want to diversify their supply chains away from China to Vietnam, Mexico, India, or even back to the US. But that shift takes time, money, and stability. If the policy environment is likely to shift again, why pour millions into new factories or supplier training programs? Why risk signing long-term contracts in emerging markets that may also fall under future tariffs? Even automation, often seen as a solution to labor shortages and rising costs, can't scale quickly enough to address short-term disruptions. Self-driving trucks, AI-powered warehousing, and robotic production lines offer promise, but they're not yet ready to replace the global supply chain. In the meantime, companies have to rely on existing systems, ones still reeling from COVID-19 inflation, labor shortages, and now policy volatility. So the root cause is not just tariffs, it's instability. Without a clear, consistent trade policy framework, businesses operate defensively. That defensive posture is reflected in higher prices, lower inventories, slower hiring, and reduced innovation. And ultimately, it's consumers, not policymakers, who bear the cost of that uncertainty every time they make a purchase. You've seen the prices: groceries, electronics, basic goods, everything's still more expensive. But didn't tariffs just drop? Yes, from 145% to 30%. But the damage was already done. Supply chains broke, orders froze, then surged, trucks ran out, ports clogged up, and companies, they raised prices and kept them high. Why? Because uncertainty is expensive, and even now no one knows what happens after the 90-day pause. So yes, the tariff dropped. But the cost, it's still right there on your receipt.